Good evening. Good evening, Prime Minister. Delighted to have you with us on behalf of The Economist. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, everybody who's listening online. We are being live streamed, and I believe we have an audience in 14 countries listening to us this evening. But it's great to have you all with us in this room. It's good to be back in Sofia. My name is Joan Hoey, and I'm the director for the Democracy Index at The Economist. And I'm going to be your moderator and your compere this evening. Now, that young lady who just played for you, her name is Floralyn. She is a musician and a singer-songwriter who is making a big name for herself in the UK and internationally, and we shall hear more from her a little bit later this evening. I'd like to thank all our speakers in advance, and I'd like to thank our sponsors. You can see all their names here behind me on the screen. Now, we're going to start this evening. This is going to be an evening of food, fun, and forecasts. And we're going to start with some forecasts. I'm going to take you through The Economist top 10 tips and trends for 2023. And I've got about 15 minutes to do that. Now, the world in 2023, the world ahead. You can see the publication on your tables. Please take a copy home with you and have a read. This is our annual publication where we, The Economist, and my colleagues at the Economist Intelligence Unit try to predict what will happen in the year ahead. So I'm going to talk about 10 points, and I've got a very short time to do that, so it's going to be a tall order. So let's get started. And I think the place to start is obviously the big geopolitical event that began last year, around this time last year in February 2022, the war in Ukraine, which has been the main driver of everything that's been happening in the world economy over the past year, and it will continue to be the case in 2023 as well. It's no longer the pandemic, but it's the war in Ukraine and the fallout from that big event that is affecting all of us, whether we're in business or as private citizens, politicians, international organizations. And of course, this has been the big driver of energy prices, commodities prices, and inflation over the past year. It's driving a really rapid monetary policy tightening. Interest rates have been going up and will continue to go up this year. It's been driving up food prices and so on. So the big question is, what will happen with the war this year? Are we likely to see an end to the conflict in 2023? Now, the world ahead uses super forecasters as well as our own journalists and analysts looking at the world. Only 9% of our super forecasters think that the war will end in 2023. Why not? I think it's clear to everybody, I'm sure in this room, that this war has become or is existential for both sides. It's existential for Ukraine, which is fighting to defend its national sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and in that sense is absolutely vital and existential. And for Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, it's become existential for the future of his regime as well. It's also the case that neither side is likely to be able to inflict a decisive defeat on the other. Ukraine has Western weapons, and it will be getting more Western weapons, but Russia has numbers on its side, and that's going to keep the war going for a long time. And as long as Ukraine has the support of Europe and the whole Western world, it will have an incentive to keep fighting. Vladimir Putin's aim is to string out the war, to keep it going in the hope that European unity, in particular, will start to dissolve and unravel. And perhaps one calculation may be that in 2024, Donald Trump will be back in the White House. Well, we'll see about that, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But no decisive outcome in 2023, unless Putin were to be ousted, which is also unlikely according to our super forecasters. And even if he were to be ousted, hardliners may be more committed to this anti-Western orientation, may take over. So that's our view of the war in Ukraine. Second point, what does this mean for the world economy in 2023? So we've had a lot of talk about recessions. That started already last year. We've gone, as I said, from spike proteins to spiking prices. The pandemic started, this inflation surge, and the war has magnified that. Central banks are raising interest rates faster than they have in decades, and they're doing it together, not completely synchronized, but they're doing it in tandem. What does that mean for the world economy? At worst, it's going to mean recession for some of the major economies, particularly European economies, in 2023. At best, it will mean stagnation or very anemic growth. That's likely to be a milder outcome in the US. US economies may do a bit better than the European economy. Britain, according to the pundits and according to the IMF, is going to be the worst affected G7 economy in 2023. We may actually have growth because actually this winter has turned out to be much milder than forecast, which means that energy storage is still full. So the impact on industrial production, on growth, on major European industries in 2023 is likely to be less. Energy prices are coming down. Inflation is certainly going to be slowing very rapidly in the coming months. So actually, in 2023, it may turn out to be better than many people expected earlier in 2022. But nevertheless, there will be pain, and particularly pain inflicted by high interest rates. Many countries, and we have a strong dollar as well, which is having an impact on many countries. Many countries trade and debts are denominated in dollars, so a stronger dollar is going to raise costs for those countries, or their currencies are pegged to the dollar, so they have to raise rates in step with the US, even if they're not experiencing very high inflation. So it's going to be a tough year, but maybe not as bad a year as many people anticipated 6 months ago. Now, there is one big silver lining from the war, and that's the green or energy transition that has really been accelerated as a result of Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. There really has been an acceleration in 2022, which we expect to continue and even go faster in 2023. Now, many countries at the moment are using more coal, but that's a stopgap measure while they ramp up renewables. The International Energy Agency has said that this war is a turning point in the history of energy, And it's undoubtedly the case that that is so. European nations no longer want to be dependent on Russian gas. So we're going to see more investment, and we're seeing it already, more investment in renewables, in solar, in wind, in nuclear, and in hydrogen. And I think Bulgaria is a very good example of this silver lining. Many people might have thought that Bulgaria would have been one of the most vulnerable countries in terms of energy security, energy supply, when this war started. And then Russia cut off gas supply to Europe, including to Bulgaria. But actually, what's happened is that Bulgaria is kind of now at the center of this energy transition, this energy transformation that is taking place in Europe, because pipelines have to go through Bulgaria. So this is actually an opportunity for Bulgaria that many might not have anticipated when the war started. Now, moving on now, I think I will speed up through the next slides. Have we reached peak China? I think this is probably the most controversial prediction amongst these top 10. But one thing is clear is that sometime in April, maybe on April the 14th this year, India is going to overtake China to become the world's most populous country with a population of 1.43 billion. India will be the top country by population. China's population, by contrast, is aging and shrinking. Its workforce is shrinking. There's fewer workers, more retirees. And as we know, demographics are a big driver of growth, so it's not good for China. So that old question of whether China can get rich before it gets older is very, very pertinent. Growth in China has been slowing for other reasons too. Obviously, last year we had zero COVID, complete constraints on growth in China with these prolonged lockdowns that carried on through until December. That is now lifted. There are other reasons as well. We have this property sector bubble and crisis in China. There was a crackdown on tech firms. Some of these things are going to change in 2023, and maybe there will be a bounce back in growth in China in 2023. There's sure to be a bounce back, and that will help the global economy. But China's era of rapid catch-up growth may have ended. And some people are now speculating that it may never overtake the US economy in terms of size. And I think that's a big shift in the narrative over the past 10 years. It's no longer seen as inevitable that China will overtake the US, even if it's still likely that the Chinese economy will overtake the US in the 2030s. Now, the question is, will a slower growing China be more assertive or more accommodating in its foreign policy in the coming years? So now, turning to China's main competitor and adversary, the US, what we see is a democratic administration that has not managed to overcome the divisions and the polarization of the Trump years. Republicans took the House in the midterm elections, so now we have a divided government in the US, which is a recipe for gridlock. We're likely to see more conflict between and within the parties, because when you have tiny majorities, that means more factional infighting. And the Republicans are now likely to try and take their revenge, launch lots of investigations as payback. Cultural divides over guns, abortion, other issues, race, will really come back in 2023. And obviously, we're heading into a very brutal primary contest on the Republican side, at least. And that's going to, Donald Trump's thrown his hat into the ring, and that is going to increase conflicts and culture wars. And we're likely to see more China bashing, more America first in the run-up to the primaries. Wanted to talk briefly about potential flashpoints. Since Trump was in office, actually, the international order has become even more unstable after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which signals the end of the post-Cold War order. The obvious potential flashpoint is Taiwan. Could it become the Ukraine of Asia? Xi Jinping has pledged to reintegrate Taiwan. The question is when he might do that. On the one hand, China might think that Ukraine is a distraction, and this means it's a good time to make a move on Taiwan. On the other hand, China may have concluded that Ukraine is a salutary lesson for China of what can go wrong, that size is not everything. Only 16% of our super forecasters think that China will make a move on Taiwan in 2023. Instead, China may test the mettle of the US in the South China Sea or the East China Sea. Elsewhere, we might see more conflict, maybe on the China-India border, as we saw in 2020, when 24 soldiers died in skirmishes there. We may see more conflict in Russia's backyard. Last year, we saw more trouble in Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And I think one thing that we can see already is that when Moscow's writ does not run so far anymore, we're going to see a power vacuum in Russia's so-called near abroad. And we're likely to see more assertiveness from countries in that region, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and so on. Closer to home, might Turkey pick a fight with Greece ahead of the elections in which the President, Erdogan, is not performing so well? Greece also has elections this year coming up very soon. Or maybe even closer to home, might we see conflict in the Balkans, perhaps in Kosovo or Bosnia and Herzegovina, where tensions have been running high in the recent period since the start of the war, and where hard economic times are likely to exacerbate popular discontent. Geopolitical tensions put a spotlight on military and security alliances such as NATO. NATO does certainly appear to have been revitalized. Finland and Sweden hope to join in 2023. We also see other alliances, US-led alliances, such as the Quad, which is the US, India, Japan, and Australia, AUKUS, the US, the UK, and Australia, which are essentially anti-China alliances. They are becoming more important, and at the same time, we see the weakening of the Russia-led security and military alliance, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is an alliance of Russia with 5 ex-Soviet countries, actually weakening. So no intervention to support Armenia, for example, in the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh last year. Something a little less gloomy and something I think good news as well for Bulgaria. We've called this revenge tourism. I don't know if you know what revenge tourism is or if you've been doing it, but this is where travelers are getting their revenge on COVID, on the virus, by taking the holidays that they were denied in 2020 and 2021 by going on foreign holidays. And that's what happened last year, where we saw a 60% increase in international tourism arrivals. We think that's going to continue in 2023, maybe not at the same pace, but nevertheless, we see international tourism arrivals up by 30% this coming year. And that means that spending on tourism is, because of inflation, is more or less back, will be back to the levels of 2019. Will Chinese tourists start to come again? Before COVID, Chinese tourists accounted for 10% of international tourism arrivals. And that's collapsed, obviously, over the past few years. Chinese travelers still seem to be quite wary about traveling, but I have a hunch that we might see the same sort of pent-up demand unleashed later this year, and certainly in 2024. So good news for tourism, and good news for countries such as Greece, such as Bulgaria, which are whose economies are quite dependent on international tourism arrivals. Just to finish on something a bit more light-hearted, but actually quite serious as well, the metaverse. Now, the question is, does the metaverse have legs? Well, the metaverse will have legs in the sense that avatars are going to be upgraded with legs in 2023. But the real question is, does anybody want to do this? Will the idea of working and playing in virtual worlds catch on beyond video games? Well, we'll see in 2023. And probably one thing that needs to happen for the metaverse to get legs is better headsets. And we don't have good headsets at the moment, but the big news is that Apple will launch its first headset in 2023. And as with smartphones and tablets and smartwatches, that may be a game changer. Apple's philosophy is we don't have to be the first, so long as we're the best. So it will be interesting to see whether that really makes a difference to the metaverse. I think Apple are going to be talking about mixed reality, not metaverse. And Meta's renaming certainly seems to have been an own goal. And we'll see if Meta will stick with its bet on virtual reality and the metaverse as its share price continues to languish. Quick final point about jargon, new year, new jargon. Every year, big events that happen change the way we speak, change the language and the terminology that we use. Just look at what's happened in recent years. Suddenly we have a pandemic, and everybody is talking about immunology and vaccinology and spike proteins and all these things we had no clue about. Then we have a war, and everybody is talking about HIMARS, frozen conflicts, HIMARS rocket systems, counter battery fire, and stuff like this. And no doubt we're going to see more of that. Technology, the terminology is changing all the time. And one big change that is happening this year is that we can stop talking about passwords pretty soon, and we have to start talking about pass keys. And I think perhaps this change is going to be more consequential even than metaverse. These are digital keys protected by biometrics that cannot be guessed, that cannot be forgotten, and that cannot be lost. And the way it's been supported by all of the big tech companies, Apple, Microsoft, and Google, and this will use facial recognition or fingerprint tech on your phone to unlock cryptographic keys on your devices and log you into stuff. People are already probably using it in this room, and it works. So that's one big change that is coming. Now, just in conclusion, in retrospect, the pandemic marked the end of a period of relative stability in geopolitics and economics. Today's world is much more unstable, convulsed by unpredictability, geopolitics, the aftershocks of the pandemic, economic upheaval, extreme weather events, rapid social and technological change. So unpredictability is the new normal, and what that means for all of us is adaptability. We have to adapt to this new reality, and we hope that reading The World Ahead, The World in 2023, will help you to face up to whatever is coming in this year ahead. Thank you very much for listening to that top 10 tips from the world ahead. Now, very shortly, we're going to be hearing from our guest of honor and keynote speaker,